welcome everyone to the final event of the Virtual World Biodiversity Forum Spring Series. It's my pleasure to speak to you or have a discussion with you about positive futures for biodiversity, thinking about where we could actually be going in the future. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Philip Bloem, who will give us the keynote address. Philip is a historian, a philosopher, and an author of several novels, politics and philosophy. His books combine historical research, philosophical inquiry, and he's actually taken an essayistic approach. And it's a pleasure actually to hear him speak and follow his thought processes. And I'm really pleased that he's here with us today. And then on the panel, we have Laura Pereira from the Stockholm Resilience Center and also from the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at Stellenbosch University. She's working on sustainability transformations, but also in a project called the Seeds of the Anthropocene, where they're thinking about showcasing all those little positive seeds that could actually be something where bigger things can grow. She is very passionate about allowing the diversity of developing country stories to be heard. So I'm looking forward to Laura's insights. The same for Sweta Stotrabasham. She is a wildlife biologist from India, and she's dedicated towards working in both grassroots and the international policy field. She's actually involved in the leadership of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, and she's been working with Indigenous people, local communities on the conservation of various mammal species in India. So welcome, Sweta. And last but not least, we have Professor Casper Koch from Wageningen University. And he is actually working with various stakeholders on the development of scenarios related to climate mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity futures. And he's really skilled at bringing various people around the table and starting to think and work together. So I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. And without further ado, I would actually like to invite Dr. Bloem to give us his keynote address. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, hello, can you hear me? You can hear me. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. It's actually quite moving to be together with you, albeit only digitally, in a sort of global network of people who think about this, because I think a lot of you know what it's like to be quite alone with these thoughts. But at the moment, I have the feeling I'd much rather pick your brains about various things than trying to tell you something, but that is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm also talking to myself. This is sort of super narcissistic. I'm talking to a picture of myself. I'm looking at myself with polite skepticism, but I hope I can make you enthusiastic for what I have to say. We have just all had a global lesson in biodiversity, and that global lesson in biodiversity was the COVID crisis. We have seen evolution in action. We have seen different mutations pop up. And we have seen how that has changed our world. But I think we have also seen one thing that may yet turn out to be the beginning of something very important, because I think most people around the globe have understood that in some way that they may not have suspected, they're not outside of nature. They are not above nature. They do not dominate it, but indeed they're a part of it. And even the greatest economy of the world can be stopped in its tracks by one little chain of RNA, a very primitive being. But we are not outside of nature. We are part of it. We are much more vulnerable than we thought. We're much more entangled than we thought. We're in a curious way disempowered by this virus and have to learn to think about ourselves in a different way. Now that brings me exactly to what I'd like to speak about. Oh, and by the way, thank you very much for your comment. If you do send comments during the lecture, that's a great encouragement to me, that I actually have a feeling that I'm not just talking to myself. This brings us to what I want to talk about, which is structures. Structures of thinking, structures of feeling, structures of entire societies. And you may think that's a little bit ambitious for half an hour, but bear with me, because I think what we're just beginning to understand because of the COVID crisis and because of the climate catastrophe is our entanglement in nature, the fact that we are not sovereign, that we are not boss here. And that collides with 3,000 years of cultural history, mainly, but not only Western cultural history, but through imperialism and colonialism, a cultural history that has become in part a global cultural history. And that cultural history is, for the West, embodied in one simple sentence, which you find in the book of Genesis in the Bible, right at the beginning. And God makes Adam and Eve, and God tells them as one of the first things, subjugate the earth. So make the earth your slave. And that is the calling that they have, that is the divine order that Adam and Eve have when they're coming into the world. And that has become the leading sentence of Western, though not only Western civilization. It appears that whenever a civilization reaches a reasonably high standard of organization, a reasonable pyramidal society, as it happened in Mesopotamia, as happened in Angkor Wat, as happened in early China, as happened with the great Maya cities, thoughts of domination of nature almost naturally follow. Nature has been tamed to some degree. There have been clearings made, there's agriculture, their fields are usually irrigated. And so thoughts of the domination of nature come almost naturally. What's the difference between the Western thought and that, for instance, of Angkor Wat? I think the answer is very simple. The West was in no way better. It was not the ideas of the West that won the day in the global power stakes. The West simply had fossil fuels earlier and exploited them earlier, and therefore could disengage manual work, manual labor, muscle labor from productivity, and increase its productivity, increase its reach enormously. Now, that brings us to a curious realization when we follow this logic, which is that the idea of dominating nature, of subjugating the earth, was perhaps a kind of useful delusion for a culture of the Bronze Age. And while it was a culture of the Bronze Age, strictly local, and of course in no way in control of nature, but its hostage, it was, shall we say, a harmless delusion. It became dangerous only when fossil fuels got involved and made the technological reach of this idea so much bigger, and very soon also the political reach of this idea. And it was fueled greatly by the Enlightenment, which in fact took these ideas, these biblical ideas, and in a way secularized them. The Enlightenment is also about dominating nature, but dominating nature through science, through technology, through understanding. The Enlightenment does very little to change the view that humans are the boss on Earth, that we are here to subjugate the Earth. The Enlightenment just simply puts it in a different vocabulary. And another different vocabulary for being the boss of the Earth comes in the late 20th century, and that is the vocabulary of the free market. It's usually referred to as a neoliberal project, but however you want to refer to it, the idea that the free market can expand, grow, exploit, dominate is strangely familiar when you look at the Bible. Not very much has changed there, has shifted there. And I'm telling you all this because I'm exactly interested in those shifts. Because we have lived with a model of eternal expansion. I don't need to tell you that, you all know more about that than I do. But this model has now come to its natural limits, quite literally. You know that every minute in the world, 30 football pitches of rainforest are destroyed and 1 million liters of ice, 1 billion tons of, I need to get my numbers right here, of ice vanish from the Greenland ice shelf. And it doesn't take, you don't need to be a Nobel Prize winner to see that this logic cannot continue for a long time. So the logic of growth has reached its natural limits. And we are beginning to literally choke on the consequences of our unprecedented historical success as a civilization. And this is the point at which we stand, and this is the point at which we are completely lost because we don't have a playbook for what's going on. For the last 3,000 years, our paradigm of success has been to subjugate the earth, to exploit, to grow, to dominate. And now that it appears that nature simply says there's no further step in this direction, we don't in fact have alternatives, alternative ambitions. And I think one of the great challenges, you are facing these challenges in a different way. You are actually working on protecting species. You're actually working on protecting biosystems, etc. I can only come at this from a cultural and from a philosophical angle, but I think the challenge is precisely to change the structures, to change our ambitions, to change the playbook of our culture. Now, how is that possible? First of all, I believe that people don't change their mind because of good arguments. People change their minds because of experiences they make. And when they make new experiences, when they make experiences which are no longer explained by what they already believe to know, then they become open to new arguments and new explanations. But usually only then. Only when their own explanation no longer suffices are people open enough to engage with something else. In climate terms, you can see that very clearly in a period that I've done a little bit of work on, the so-called Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was a period between the late 16th century and the, say, early 18th century, when the global temperature dropped by about 2 degrees. Now, we don't know exactly why, and that is a different discussion. Let's leave that aside for a moment. And let's see what were the consequences of this. Well, the consequences were quite simply, I can only say this for Europe because the historical records are best for Europe, especially when it comes to the cultural implications. But we can assume that similar things were going on in other civilizations and other continents as they were struggling with climate change at their time. But in Europe, you find that, of course, a drop of 2 degrees mean temperature means a drop of up to 10 degrees in winter. And some winters were catastrophic. Summers were very short and rainy. Harvests failed, and failing harvests in a continent that was entirely built on local agriculture meant social catastrophe, meant upheaval and unrest. And that's exactly what happened. And you get the reaction that you expect exactly from a society like that, a late medieval society. What do people do when they realize that the weather is no longer hospitable to their life? They go and pray. They pray in churches, they have processions, they castigate themselves, they sing songs, they bring relics up to the glaciers in the Alps to force them to stop and not engulf another village because the glaciers are growing. But as you may imagine, the climate is not particularly impressed by this. So the old answer, the answer of the old culture, which is that if you break your contract with God, he will punish you and you have to show contrition, and then he will be well disposed to you again. That didn't seem to work anymore. And it didn't seem to work for 2 or 3 generations. And so you see new answers coming. You get the first empirical scientists, botanists, who make experiments to say, how can we actually make agriculture more productive? You get trade, which brings supplies to far away, far-flung regions. Amsterdam becomes rich because it takes trade. It took grain from the Baltics and brought it as far as southern Italy. And with the trade, you also get other things. You get markets in cities that become much more important and much more international. And markets are built on a kind of pragmatic tolerance. It's not important what the person that you're doing business with does in his free time or which god he or she prays to. It's important that that person keeps their contract. So you can afford to be much more tolerant in a market situation. Also, it brought more international people, more international ideas. It strengthened the middle class. It strengthened the merchants and the lawyers and the doctors who were part of this. So it began the reaction to this climate change, which was an involuntary and piecemeal reaction, but simply because the logic of things always pushed things in one direction, it began to assume a sort of coherent face, and you saw a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of society emerging, partly because of climate change. Now, this is what I want to talk to you about, because if we want to imagine different futures, if we want to imagine positive futures, it is important to understand this logic and how it can be shifted, how we can be part of that shift. That is always experimental and that we can never be sure about, but that seems very necessary. And you see that if you look at historical examples, I'm hesitant to say parallels because that always is a bit too easy, but if you look at historical moments, you see that in moments of crisis, new kinds of knowledge become possible. And with that, new kinds of societies become possible, because the myths a society has, be it that of subjugate the earth, they usually, actually, they always mirror the power structures of the society, the ideas of virtue and vice, of morality that society has, the idea of achievement and the idea of failure, of shame that society has. And they are mirrored and they're dressed up as gods and they're given episodes to play. But we are really talking about this society. So our society has had the image of the thrusting explorer and conqueror as the image of its hero, would of course pass this on to future generations. And this image is beginning to crack now. And through these cracks, we're beginning to see a world of new possibilities. And this is only the very initial stage of this. But let me give you a few examples where I think there's something exciting happening here. There is the political field that some of you are active in, the field of NGOs, where what has been taken for granted is no longer accepted by people who engage with these things. And let me just say in parenthesis, I think this is one of the very, very important things that the COVID crisis leaves us with. People like you and I who've gone around saying that this mad hyper-capitalistic system of eternal growth and exploitation cannot continue. These people have usually been told, well, but what can we do? There is no alternative. We cannot interfere with the markets. It is quite impossible. And then in the COVID crisis, exactly that happened. Within days, we interfered with the markets. Societies took political, moral decisions for their own safety that were not interested in market priorities. And markets, at least at the beginning, were not terribly good in supplying what people needed to fight the crisis. So the market as the only paradigm seems to have failed. And What else can we see? Well, we can see the conversation changes like Fridays for Future, which has probably changed more conversations at dinner tables between parents and children than anything else in recent times. We can also see new kinds of thinking emerging in novels, in plays, in films. For instance, oh God, now I've forgotten the title of the book. I will come back to you for that. A fantastic novel by Richard Powers, Overstory, that is the name. A novel that is largely about trees and their connections with people. But I think the greatest point where we see the overstory, yes, you're quite right. But I think the greatest point where we see a new world emerging is science. Because science has recently, scientific research has recently shown us that our understanding of what humans are really does come from the Bronze Age. The idea of a rational, free being that is sealed off, insulated from the outside world, and takes decisions in a sovereign and rational way has been enormously undermined, for instance, by the discovery of the microbiome and the fact that we have much more non-human cells and indeed non-human DNA inside us than human DNA. The fact that this influences every aspect of our physical and even our intellectual being. It has been called into questions by things like epigenetics, which show that experiences, especially traumatic experiences, can indeed be learned and handed down to future generations. In other words, we are beginning to discover ourselves, to discover humankind as much more part of nature, much more entangled, much less separated from the rest of nature, but indeed just simply something inside this enormous complex system, which I always think of as a mobile, you know, what babies have above their beds. And when you touch one bit, it is connected to all other little figures in this web. And when you touch one, they all begin to move. And you begin to understand that you can't change anything in this enormously complex system without ultimately beginning to change everything. That's a very different thought from the idea of dominating nature. And I think that is the beginning of what we could imagine as a positive change. We are entangled, contextual, vulnerable, far less rational than we would like to be. But we are able to accelerate evolution, our evolution, through culture, which is a mechanism that we have developed much more strongly than any other animal. And the positive futures that we are beginning to see will have to be based on cooperation rather than domination, not because we are becoming more ethical human beings, because if history tells us anything, is that we're not. Indeed, as John Gray says, we may have more scientific knowledge, but that doesn't mean that we are more rational. Not because we're better human beings, but because simply we understand that our place in nature demands the fact that we cooperate in just a conflicting way, as many species of plants and animals and mushrooms cooperate in a symbiosis that is not of their choosing. I just told you that in the early mythologies really mirrored the structure of the societies that we had, that were there. I believe the same is true today. The structures we project as our mythology, not only as old biblical mythologies, but also the new mythologies of films, of computer games, of social media, etc. They are very important because they create an image of what is virtue and what is vice, what is worth achieving and what has to be avoided. They make us these stories we tell about ourselves. And it is time that we're beginning to tell a new story, not a story of the creature that has learned to dominate the earth, but the story of the primate that is slowly learning to accept its place in nature. And to accept that, to manage that, we will need all the resources of science, of technology, and of imagination to muster this enormous cultural change away from 3,000 years of cultural history. But perhaps, I think that the very idea of biodiversity can be our leading star here. The fact that we can only thrive if we tap the strength of others. The fact that we cannot live if we only rely on ourselves. And the fact that only through accepting our entanglement in nature can we begin to make the decisions which allow us, in a situation that is by and large catastrophic, still to push every time that decisions are to be made, the decision tree in a direction that is not catastrophic, but that allows us a positive future together. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Blom, for a very inspiring address. And yes, there's what you told us about us needing to become connected again, becoming part again of nature, realizing that we actually entangled in the web of nature. I think that that's incredibly important. And incidentally, that was actually one question that was asked of us when we were starting out with the very first session of the series, is like, how can we actually get back to realizing that we're actually part of nature? How can we actually get back to this? Because we're so far removed from this. We like sitting in our flats in the city, most of us, and we lost this connection. So it's like, how can we actually change the narrative? How can we actually get back, realize our connectedness to nature? How can we become again a part of nature? Maybe that's something I can post to you, and then the others would like to pick up on this as well.
Well, just very briefly, I mean, this is a huge challenge because not everybody has got the luxury to go into nature. In fact, most people don't. Most people by now live in cities and live in poor areas of cities. So, but you can also say, of course, it is perhaps enough to reach a critical minority. And, you know, of course, you have to try to make this change. And I think it can only go through education. I mean, we're really talking about a cultural revolution here. A cultural revolution, not in the Chinese sense, but in the sense of doing away with a recipe for culture that has been powerful for a long time, subjugate the earth, but that has really become fatal now, and replacing it with a completely different way of understanding ourselves, a way of understanding ourselves that historically would be perhaps closer to nomads, because nomadic people, not because they were better or wiser, this is important to understand, but because they didn't have the resources. They could never see themselves as above nature. They always understood themselves as being a very precarious part of nature. Mm-hmm. And needing natural forces at every step to cooperate with them. So I think if we can capture a sense of our nomadic existence, even if it is only our nomadic existence on this planet, the fact that we are vulnerable, the fact that we absolutely rely on the systems of the earth has, and yes, of course, also intensifying an experience of nature. And I hope, by the way, that this will happen. When I want to look at positive futures, for instance, I look at city planning. And you see cities that are vertical forests and have got rid of cars and look after their own energy supplies. And that is an exciting moment where I think people in 50 years or in 100 years will shake their heads at the idea that we lived in deserts of stone, burning oil, and thinking that this is the good life. And these are ideas that entertain me and interest me, but also where I think, yes, perhaps change is possible.
Thank you. Casper, maybe you would like to pick up on this. It's like you've been frowning at me.
I have an hour, right?
Yes.
So first of all, there were many things that resonated to what I already scribbled down before this session started, just using slightly different words. But I think what I want to pick up on most is Philip, what you said about arguments that are not going to make people change, experience will. And I think certainly talking for myself as a scientist, I think we should stop seeing science as the cornerstone of the solutions. I sit in the IPBES and I'm limited to peer-reviewed scientific literature that gives me maps and it gives me numbers and gives me statistics. But we have plenty of that. I think we need much less analytical learning of people and much more experiential learning. Or in simpler terms, you know, we don't need to convince the head. People understand the message, but they don't feel it. So we did one big project where I will remember very little of, even though it was one of the best projects on climate change mitigation and adaptation I ever did. But what I will remember is a theater play that took place in one of the evenings. And that made the coordinator cry and made me shiver. And that I will still remember in 10 years. So I think we need to have a completely set of different methods that looks outside of the certainly environmental science, because that's not going to convince anybody. I saw one chat comment, it is so hard to change people. It's so hard. So I think we need very, very different methods. And other sciences, perhaps not non-scientific, but certainly in the big realm of all the social sciences. There's so much we could tap in.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Casper. Maybe Sweta, you've been nodding very enthusiastically. Maybe you want to take this further.
Yeah, I think, definitely a lot to think about. And Philip, you gave us a lot of like, a chance to like stop and reflect on it, not just as our lifelines, but also with like the historical view. So that was quite interesting. And it's been a long time that we've got this just time to like pause and reflect in the Zoom world where you're constantly like going from one meeting to another and trying to just get things done. So I would first say thank you for, helping us get this time to reflect. I completely agree with what Casper was saying, that this is what we're realizing more and more. Like we as biologists and zoologists, all of us are very good at talking about the stats, talking about the research, but we are not able to get to that experience changing narrative, because what we always felt like if we give the right numbers, people will kind of get scared and then they'll be like, oh, let's make this happen because the polar ice caps are melting and then we'll all die. But that hasn't really caused got people to change. And what you're saying does make a lot of sense, and a lot of people are talking about this, that storytelling and bringing in that experience changing thing, like how Casper mentioned, like you will not remember the paper, but you might remember your experience of being in a theater. And that's absolutely true. And somehow we as biologists have kind of gone away from that, and we need to find a way to get back there to really communicate our messages in a better manner. And yeah, I mean, I'm just more in agreement for it. The other thing I really liked with what you were saying is, I like the word you used, the changing playbook of culture. We need to change the playbook of culture. And I think that's what we have to like start seeing more critically as, how do we do that? How do we change this cultural narrative that is what is needed right now? We cannot, all what we have done has taken us so far. And if we need to go beyond and we need to like get masses to come with us, we need that cultural change. And I think definitely maybe having your insights on how you think this cultural change can come about. How do we bring in people to create that cultural change? Because clearly, as you said, they've realized praying doesn't work. And now I think young people are seeing that actions, you can take action, and you can create change with your voice, a collective voice that you have. But how do you see this cultural change really happening? And how do you see youth taking up this role of helping it happen?
Thanks, Victor. Yes, Philip.
Well, thank you, Sveta, for a wonderful question. Let me just try to say something about that. First of all, I was really struck there's a French philosopher called Bruno Latour, whom I like a lot. He has coined a lot of these thoughts. He has got a wonderful saying, which is that we simply don't have enough earth for all this progress, meaning, you know, the resources are simply too limited for the progress that we are running. He has also pioneered the idea that we don't live on Earth, but inside the critical zone, which is the thin membrane of gas between the dead stone beneath our feet and the eternal void above our heads. And in this membrane of gas, we somehow have to become a successful resident, because otherwise it won't be there anymore. But he said something else in an interview that I find quite helpful in answer to your question, which is that he said before the French Revolution could happen and a republic could happen in France, different figures needed to be sent on the stage of the national conversation. Figures like, characters like the people, like social justice, like freedom. And then people could learn to think in terms that made a republic possible. As long as you only think of a sovereign and subjects, that conversation can't even start. So I think one of our jobs is really to bring new characters on the stage of the conversation that we are having and giving them life. And I think for that we have one ally, which is simply history, climate change. Because the world is changing around people and you have to be very blind and very obstinate not to notice any of it. And people are beginning to understand that, you know, I live in Austria and it's traditionally a great skiing country. Not so much anymore. And this makes people listen up because, you know, this has been a part of the economy, but also part of the identity of the country. And all of a sudden, you know, there are winters when it's no longer plausible. And these are the kind of experiences that make people realize, well, hang on, perhaps I need something else to understand what's happening here. And perhaps if my ambition to run a ski lift or to run a hotel for tourists is no longer realizable, what else could I do? What else could this village become? Could this country become? And these conversations are beginning. They're beginning slowly and between you and me, far too slowly. But we can accelerate them. We can try to accelerate them. And I think once experiences are beginning to change, then we can realize that the most scarce and underused resource we have in this fight is imagination. We need to be able to imagine, to have the courage to imagine a different future. And we have to have the courage to go forward, even if it is counterfactual. To give you a bit of a frivolous example, if you fall in love with someone, you think that person is absolutely wonderful and I want to spend the rest of my life with that person, have children, grow old with, then the worst thing you can do is to look at the numbers. And then you see, you know, lots of marriages get divorced and sex after 10 years isn't great anymore. There are people who don't even like their children. Children are terribly expensive and they cripple you in your career. And, you know, then there's domestic violence. So why would you bother? Because you think, yes, but for me, it will be different. For us, it will be different. And because you think that, which is obviously counterfactual when you look at the statistics, only because you think that you make it possible, you allow it to happen, perhaps. And I think we need to be that counterfactual. We need to say, yes, all the numbers are wrong, but we know we can make it. And only if we think that do we give ourselves a chance to actually make it.
Thank you. Maybe I can exactly. I wanted to ask Laura to talk to this exactly because she mentioned the game that they developed in a chat. She's working on a seat of the Anthropocene Project. I'm sure she's got some interesting thoughts to share.
Thanks, Cornelia. And unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about the Seeds Project yet, but what I wanted to raise is that is a little bit of a contestation to get some excited conversations going amongst the panelists. And I think by the time we hit experience, it's too late. And it's particularly too late in many parts of the world that are already going to be experiencing the effects of, for example, climate change or ecological degradation by the time the West actually gets hit by something. So I think I fully agree that it's not necessarily the facts that are going to talk to people, but there's a really great quote by Alex Evans that talks about the power of stories. And I think it's the narratives and exactly what you were talking about, the imagination that we need to capture and those different narratives we need to tell ourselves about what is possible. That's really, really critical. And sort of linking on that, I think it was also just a little bit of a pushback on this notion of universal we that's being constructed, because the we is, as I think you're very well aware, is very much sort of sitting within a Western European dominated paradigm. And I think that if we start to unpack the difference and the plurality of perspectives, of ways of being within this world, that we actually have the potential to draw on, we'll actually have a much richer set of imaginations that we can actually use to construct these visions of the future that I think we need to be aspiring towards. And so for me, what has been so what for me has been really, really inspirational has been working with bringing in imaginative capacities into processes, as Casper was mentioning, that you can actually mix art and science quite well. Diego Galafasi's been doing some really good work. I've also worked with some colleagues, and I can put all the links in the chat so that everyone has access to these papers if they want to read them. But on these more experiential futures processes where you can bring in the science, you can talk about, well, that's actually biophysically impossible. But sort of this exercise we ran on Survive the Century, which was around trying to get a bit more of a social, cultural, political sense of what geoengineering technology could actually mean for the future and how wrong it could potentially go. And maybe there are pathways for how it could go right, but how they're extremely narrow. And, you know, there was this really interesting point where there's a bunch of climate modelers in there. And I said, you know, you're going to have 5-meter sea level rise by 2100. And they're like, that's impossible. And I was like, well, this is now happening, so you're going to have to deal with it. And they came up with the scenario of, well, actually, if some crazy person were to go in and blow up the West Arctic ice sheet, yes, you could actually reach those kinds of levels, you know. So what we think about, you know, this pushback on some of the science, I think in those narratives and really testing our brains to use our imagination to think through the unthinkable, because the kinds of transformations that we're thinking about towards a more sustainable, towards a more just and equitable world are similar to the kinds of thoughts that a medieval peasant needed to envision about the Industrial Revolution, right? This is the Seeds Project idea. The seeds are there, but the kinds of capacities to imagine those kinds of futures really require us to build new ways of actually thinking. And right now we're not using all of the diverse plural experiences and knowledges and connections and entanglements. I really love that word, entanglements. Sort of talks a lot of Lemargulis's work. Entanglements that can actually help us unpack and navigate visions for different futures, knowing that we're not actually going to get to that particular outcome, but that by going through that process of thinking through what potential sort of outcomes could be there, you know, we'll make different decisions in the present, and those narratives are hopefully going to be the important impetus towards that kind of change. So those are my thoughts on the discussion to get something sparked. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very, very important pushback, and I love it. And look, I'm an historian, and I can only talk about what I know about. And let me just address two little things. First of all, the we, and of course you're right. But the we I use, I wouldn't say it's a Western European, but it's definitely a Western or a global Northern wealth we. Because simply, this is where the greatest leverage power lies. In, you know, if it comes to de-investment in fossil fuels, if it comes to reducing fossil fuel footprints, you know, people in Europe can do more than people in South Africa, because people in South Africa already have much lower fossil footprints. So, you know, I think the global wealth we, you're entirely right. It is not the only we that's there, and we need the other voices, and we need to listen to these other voices. with a good dose of humility, and understand that our kind of knowledge is one successful kind of knowledge, but a limited one. But I think it is, I mean, I'm usually speaking to the global wealth we, because I think that that is the people who, first of all, are likely to listen to me. And secondly, the people who have a great role to play in making any of these changes possible. But the second image that I just wanted to bring into the conversation, because I think it can be quite useful. You spoke of narratives, and I do that often myself, but when you sort of speak about goals we can reach, I always also think that as a philosophical tool, it's quite interesting to think about maps. Because maps, of course, only work if they don't represent the world as it really is. They simplify, they censor, they edit, they only show you the important stuff. But through that, of course, they also limit what you can find. And even what you can aspire to, because it just shows you a certain kind of goal, a certain kind of place, what the map maker thought worth putting in. So I think our challenge is to some extent to draw new maps to navigate through the world. Maps that allow us to find other stuff, that allow us to find other goals, that allow us to go other ways. And that to me is the conceptual challenge. How can we redraw the maps of our knowledge about the world? And how can we find ways of telling ourselves narratives of navigating through the world that allow us to find different goals? Because the goals of expansion and domination are clearly of yesterday. The new goals we have already as nice ideas, and they sound fantastic, but how they will become political realities is something that we can only tentatively approach. So I think for that, I always like to use the idea of a map and where it can lead us.
So yes, so I mean, I also know maps as a tool that we actually, when you work with people on scenarios and trying to figure out how they see the world, that we actually use maps and big sheets of paper and have people draw on how they actually see the world and try to actually come to common vision. And one important point that has actually been raised in the chat as well is like, how can we actually, we have been talking about changing narratives and changing the we's. How can we actually address the issue of Indigenous knowledge? How can we actually bring in the Indigenous knowledge, knowing very well that most of the land under conservation is in Indigenous hands? Indigenous people are the custodians, and how do we actually ensure that these voices are heard, that these visions are actually brought into the discussions? And Casper, you nodding, and then Sweta as well. I think you've got something to say on this, and Dora. Maybe Casper, you want to start, and then we.
Well, I read that question beforehand, and I found that the hardest one to answer. And you saw it in the chat as well. There's lots of hows. And the one thing I scribbled down without looking at Indigenous knowledge specifically is that we can learn from the local. I think there is so many good methods for, you know, a neighborhood in a slum in Kenya, an Indigenous tribe in Costa Rica. And there is fantastic methods out there to be super creative and go beyond the imaginary. And they've been used and they've been tested. But what it has, the flavor it has, it's the flavor of unscientific knowledge. Or I think it ties in with the other one where Philip said, like, well, the we is the global wealth we, because those are the ones you can change, but those are also the ones that really do not want to change. And if you go to the local people in the slum in Kenya, you know, those want to change. So it's much easier to go into a very transformative process of what needs to happen, and it needs to happen right now when you have all the noses in the same direction and there's one vision. And I think the hidden vision of the global wealth is let's maintain the situation we have now because we might lose some of our wealth. So a lot of the issue is right there. Is not per se to have methods to structure or represent marginalized groups, but the fact that they're marginalized, and many people don't want to change that. And I think the Millennium Assessment did a very, very good job, and they had a beautiful workshops in very local Indigenous groups and methods that have since been underused. And I think they're there. I think the how question doesn't need to be answered, it's there. You ask the right people, you get 10 methods to try with a whole bunch of different people, and it's a full stakeholder participation of everybody you want in, including indigenous people. But the problem is, if you have your product, it's very often not a quantitative map. And the quantitative map still sells better to a national level politician. So that's where my frustration is personally, actually. I think we don't lack the experience to do it, but we lack the global wealth to see that there is much more value in what we present to them than what they think there is.
Let me just append a little observation to that. Thank you for that. And yes, I think we are also observing that, and this may be actually a sort of leverage point as well, which is why it interests me. You say the global wealth is interested in the status quo, and I think that is partly why in the West we are seeing deteriorating democracies at the moment. Our societies no longer have a project for the future. They know there is no good future for them if we continue as we do. So the best thing is to keep what we have now and not to give it away, and to keep it for as long as we can. And that's not much of a project. And I think a society without a project decays. The project will be right in front of our noses. It's called a Green New Deal. That would give enormous amounts of work, and that would actually give people a plausible future to hope for. And that's what we're talking about here. If you can say, well, actually, we are building the country that in 50 years can still have a functioning economy and a functioning society and not destroy its surroundings, that is a project that it's worth actually doing something for. So I think changing the narrative partly is also giving back our societies a sense of a plausible future, a sense of plausible hope.
And with that, I'd like to hand over to Sweta, because she's working for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, and I keep following them on Instagram. So, and I've been working with them, and I think they're doing exactly, I think, what Philip's been asking for. So Sweta, maybe you want to share a few things.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things definitely with what Casper was talking about with like the indigenous knowledge and how we can look at it. I think one comment I did have is the we that you are thinking about with the global north and people who want to keep their wealth. Maybe there's also a time to start questioning that wealth and saying, what is this wealth that you really are trying to keep so dear to yourself? And I think traditional knowledge and indigenous people have a way of showing us another wealth that is actually in the world, and that actually might be much more beautiful than the wealth that you are trying to, save up for God knows whom. So, I think that's one thing. And I think young people are realizing that for us, like, money doesn't make any sense anymore. Like, you kind of, after a certain stage, there are like people who are in poverty, obviously for them, it is very, very important. And you have to first get that basic standard of living. But once you do get to that standard of living and you get a little bit more, I guess then you realize that whatever more wealth you get, it's not going to give me any more satisfaction. And we realize that you need something else now. And that is what I think we are learning from like indigenous people. We're learning how to, cherish the wealth of nature and the world, and actually realize that being materialistic doesn't really give you that same satisfaction as, connecting with something much bigger, like nature itself, and being a part of it. The power that has is it's transcending everything else, and that nothing that money can really give you. So I think that kind of feeling and that experience, I think when you're discussing experiences, that is what I think the people with the wealth have to start seeing and realizing, that you can't eat money and you can't save it, and even if you save money, that doesn't mean you'll have air to breathe. So what will you do? So, and I think that kind of experiential exchange could be quite kind of critical to make them reshift and rethink what is really dear to them. Following up on what Cornelia was mentioning, we in the Global Youth Biodiversity Network recently started this campaign where we are kind of with a lot of what Philip was talking about, with like the world and how there are certain things that are happening, which we are considering is same and has not changed in several decades. And we are kind of putting a stand that says we want to stop the sameness in the world. We are tired of seeing the same conversations. We are tired of seeing the same fossil fuels. We're tired of seeing the same broken promises and exactly the same old story. So we are kind of pushing that back and that narrative back and kind of questioning everybody, saying, if you say something, then, you said the same thing 10 years back. Let's stop the same and let's get to doing something different, something that is diverse, culturally, racially, biologically, something that is transformational, something that can really, move to the getting the new experience. But I think just reflecting back on what you were saying, what we were trying to do is basically realize that we wanted people to experience and understand that what is in the world they have experienced is the same, and it's not going to take us to anywhere good. And therefore, now we need to experience something new. And that's what we've been trying to show them, that how do we envision or re-envision a world that is not the same, and what is the path, or you can call it a map to that, the direction to that world. And that's what we have shown as the youth vision, and what young people think is needed to go and live in harmony with nature in the next several years. So I think these are some of the ideas that we have been pushing forward as young people, and definitely already linked with the indigenous communities. We have developed most of these ideas with young people. Our main policy coordinator comes from an indigenous she's an indigenous person from the Philippines. So, we kind of ensure that their value system and our value system are in line, and we want our future to be in line with what they already see as, their vision of the worldview. And I think that could be a practical way of seeing how we as young people are taking it forward and really integrating indigenous knowledge into what we want to push for in the future.
That was an excellent observation. And let me just, because what I think is very important. I mean, for me, it's also a lot to do with identity. What you said, the different kinds of wealth that you have, and I think, as an historian, because I think it's interesting to see this structurally. Modernity has bulldozed so many traditional structures down that we have learned in the West to buy our identity through consumption, because we don't grow up with strong traditional identities, and those strong traditional identities can be held for many women, for gays, etc. But they obviously have a strong advantage because we have a hankering for identity. And I think part of the conversation, a part of this project will have to be to allow people to discover a difference, an identity that is based on something else than consumption, and something else than the traditional paradigms, which are often dry of explanations for people. So developing an identity, for instance, that is a planetary identity, an entangled identity, an identity as one interesting species of this planet, that seems to me a worthwhile project, because at the heart of the rush to consume is the anxiety of a very weak identity.
Just quickly to follow up, I mean, I think you hit a very, very core point. I'm from India. I lived my entire life in India, and I just recently came to live in New York. And the biggest stark difference I saw is with this thing, like every festival is related to consumption and related to shopping, and every festival they have, every celebration is buying things. And I could never understand it, because in India, it was never like that. So, that is a big stark difference I saw. And I mean, when you said it, it really smack on solidified that idea that, there is this consumption, which is kind of what the person, you're building on, your culture is building on. And thank you so much for, it was really cool that we thought about that.
Thank you. I would actually hand the word over to Laura, and there's something in the chat that's said on we should actually talk about preposterous futures, and I think you've got something, you've got a few things you wanted to say to us.
Thanks, Kanita. I'm sorry, I've just come out of 3 days worth of meetings where the entire conversation actually happened in the chat rather than in the conversation. So I'm still stuck in that mode of communication. But so to what I think you were saying, I mean, this idea of diversity and plurality is, I think, really at the core of this agenda. And I would say that it's actually part of the Decolonial Project, about getting away from sameness and recognizing that we don't just have one history, right? So we don't just have one present that we all experience, and therefore there are going to be a plurality of different futures out there. And the more diversity we can get into that, I think the more resilience we can build into the navigation towards something that is more sustainable, that is more just. So we're not being dominated by a particular paradigm or viewpoint that's been informed by sort of all the philosophical points that Philip is raising, from Descartesian sort of dichotomies all the way through to sort of this idea of control over nature, sort of the Christian Genesis story, all of that. And Caspar actually mentioned this when he referred to IPES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and I'm only going to say that once, now that everyone knows what it is I'm talking about. And I think that this has been a really interesting challenge that has been sort of put forward to us to try and work at a global assessment level while still being true to this idea of plurality and diverse values. There's an ongoing assessment on values at the moment that's really, really grappling with this. And, you know, we're coming up with different tools. I think it's because there's a recognition by the scientists that we need to be able to do this. But a lot of the structures or the institutions within which we find ourselves are still very much configured around a monolithic sort of viewpoint and way of unpacking things. And so, you know, there's an encouragement to use not just peer-reviewed literature, and I've seen sort of art and theatre referenced, also referenced through papers that talk about them, which is sort of another thing that we can unpack there around whose voice is actually getting heard. But there's an increasing sort of nudge towards recognizing the need for what I guess we could call participation, if nothing else, stakeholder engagement, which is kind of that very loose idea, hopefully moving more towards an idea of co-production where there's a true exchange of knowledge, not just an extraction of ideas, right? And I think that's a goal that we're really aiming towards, and, you know, we might get there, hopefully we can. But this is, and I also see some of my colleagues are on the call, and they probably have a lot more interesting things to say here. But from the task force on scenarios and models, we've developed the Nature Futures framework, and this really was this idea to capture this notion of plurality, but plurality within a set of bounds that is still within a biophysical notion of what is actually sustainable and what is just, and that these different relationships that we have with nature, and one of them is actually nature as culture. So I think that that's sort of a little bit of a pushback on the sort of people in nature idea, and more people as nature, which talks to sort of different worldviews that don't actually reinforce this dichotomy. But there is still the nature for society, the idea that we need food, we need clothes, housing, etc. from nature, that there is an important extractive component there. And then also trying to draw on what we call this nature for nature concept, which is nature for its own intrinsic value and existence, right? Which is separate from the need to have a human component to it. And that within this kind of triangle that we have, there are multiple different configurations of emphasis of these different kinds of values. And so it's a great heuristic. Putting it into practice, I think, is the really, really big challenge. And if anyone's got sort of good ideas, and I think we really do need to reach out and work a lot more with you, Sweta, and your group on being able to actually draw some of these narratives to start populating these ideas so that we can bring this diversity to the core, because I think it's only through that we're going to be able to have some sense of a broader direction. And that's where the preposterous comes in. So we've been locked into this idea of a projected future, and it's important to have it. When we talk about climate, we know that the sort of climate projections are really bad, that the impacts are going to be really bad if we continue on a business as usual trajectory. So those projections are super important. But what we think of as plausible, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't necessarily have been plausible for a medieval sort of person, or even in the Renaissance, right? And this is just within Europe. So what are the preposterous ideas, the really radical ideas around post-growth futures, for example, or animist futures, or these other kinds of ideas that either sit in our history, in our traditional knowledges, in our past, or in just a really complete reconfiguration of the current structures that we have? And so I think we need to put a lot more attention on unpacking and appreciating the beauty of these preposterous futures and the kinds of conversations that we have, and drawing on diverse knowledges and places. And this is sort of my push for, Philip was managing to mention some great books. I want to throw out there some really great African futurist authors who are really giving us a different perspective on what the world could look like. So Nadia Okorafor is definitely a favorite of mine there, Lauren Bjerkes, a few others. So those kinds of narratives that I think we need to bring more into this mainstream idea, to talk to exactly plurality and diversity. And I think those are the highlights of the take-homes for me from this. Okay, great. Thank you. Casper, you've been nodding vigorously. You've got...
No, yes, I do. Because at some point I picked up on visions, and I think that was one of the questions also that I was reading beforehand. You know, do we have to work towards one vision? And I know at some point I sat in a meeting and they said, you guys from biodiversity got it all wrong. You can only put biodiversity on the global agenda if you come up with a single figure. This was somebody from the climate change community. You know, and you don't want to know how long we debated the 2 degrees. That's also a random number that people didn't want to tap in on. So give me 70%, you know, as of biodiversity. And if you have that, then you can have people working on the ground to do real stuff, because the 70% is as meaningless as the 2 degrees, perhaps. And I'm not entirely sure whether he's right in that, but then you have one goal. But I think I by and large agree, certainly if you go down to the local situations, is that I completely agree with what Laura was saying, that it's plural, that there's diversity, and that you have to agree to disagree, and that there are trade-offs, and that there are different views on the past, different views of the present, and different views of the future. And you have to disentangle all of them and somehow bring them together. And there was a big project, I'm not sure Paula Harrison's still online, I saw her name, where we discussed a concept for a very long time. We called it controlled divergence. So on the one hand, yes, you want everybody to have their own view and everybody to do what he or she thinks. But on the other hand, in order to have impact, you have to have some structure around it, that it needs to be within bounds. And the Nature Future Framework is another way to try to do that, you know, to kind of have central messages that can come from 15 different case studies that are the same type of messages. So that makes your message so much stronger. But I think overall, and this is a lesson I learned a long time ago, and I so long I didn't do anything with it, is that people told me, listen, if you do scenarios, if you talk about the future, forget about plausibility. Forget about that it has to be likely. Forget about, first of all, forget about business as usual. The first thing you have to get people to understand is there's one thing for sure. Trend extrapolation or a business as usual reference scenario is the least likely of all futures. That's not going to happen. Let's forget about that. Modelers, please forget about that scenario, because that's not the one we're heading for. So why model it? Why even talk about it? Toss it out of the window and go for more extreme ones. And the issue is not to discuss whether a scenario is likely or plausible or probable or whatever word modelers like to attach to that, but is it useful? Is it credible? And most importantly, will it keep the stakeholders awake at night? And that's either because they worry about a very doom-gloom future, but it could also be the positive future and keep them awake. You know, how are we actually going to implement all that change that needs to happen right now? And it needs to really be done in the next 5 years. But it's really looking different at the set of scenario that you could be looking at.
Let me just say, I absolutely love the idea of the preposterous futures, and we need more of those, because it's exactly as you say, Casper, we don't yet have the models for the future we want to build, so we can't model them. The only thing we know is that we don't yet know what this future will look like. And I think evolution gives us a nice paradigm for that, which is not only controlled divergence, but evolutionary convergence. You know, the fact that eventually we wind up with what works. And for that, we need to have a lot of experiments. It's a bit like a universal basic income. You know, it's a necessary idea, but it will be implemented in stupid places, in stupid ways in different places. It will be implemented in good but inappropriate ways in particular societies. And eventually we'll get to ways that work. And I think also with imagining different futures, yes, we must, at the moment, I think is the moment for experiment and openness and exploration, because we don't yet have the scenarios. We can't yet make the models, but we can see what convergence will teach us. Just as mammals learn to have bodies like fish, if they live in the water, you know, we will find ways that work in cooperating with nature, in finding our place in nature. And there may be different works and ways in different societies. And at the moment, I think we have to be open for that.
Thank you. I think we at the moment, we're all going like, yes. and again, we're coming back to the, how are we actually going there? And there's, I'm trying to keep track of the chat as well. And there's, so exactly. So there's this question: do we now need to all learn to be Indigenous, or should we all be nomads? Also, it's like, could the decade on ecosystem restoration be the launch of such an immortality project that actually gives us this common vision where we all want to move towards to? So maybe if you can give your thoughts on that. Does anyone want to try? Laura, Casper, Laura.
The permanent academic who can't handle a silence and has to say something, even if it's completely irrelevant to the question. So I think it's an interesting idea, this notion of a common vision. And, you know, we have the SDGs as an interesting kind of global project around which we have an orientation that we're trying to sort of nudge towards. Similarly, I think the new negotiation for the CBD, for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is coming up end of this year, you know, if we can be a little bit more inspired in the target setting ideas of the direction within which we want to go, I don't think we're ever going to have a global vision because of this plurality and these different experiences and places that people sit from. But I think we do need, you know, as Casper was saying, the an orientation within a certain space, that we do want to go towards here and we don't want to go towards there kind of story. So I think that's where we're navigating at the moment. And, you know, that's once you get there, the pathways of how we actually choose particular actions in a direction, I think is where we really start to get stuck. And that's where sort of these dominant paradigms and stories of and systems that we've built up around us make it really difficult to really think about something transformative. And something that sparked for me, and it was also when we were talking about this notion of experience, and I sort of brought up, once we have the experience, it's too late, about navigating transition. And as a South African who grew up as the rainbow generation, right? He was 9 at the time of apartheid ending. You now know my age, if you know your South African history, where we were inspired by this idea of a peaceful transition, right? That we could actually do this. We could move to a post-racial society. And 20 years down the line, we've seen that actually those structural inequalities are still embedded within society, that those narratives that we told ourselves didn't actually help us to orient, because we didn't do the hard work of actually adjusting those historical legacies. And so this is where this notion that comes out of resilience thinking, of panarchy, that actually a system needs to collapse before it reconstitutes itself. And my hope as a rainbow generation millennial is that we don't have to go through a collapse, but unfortunately, I think maybe history teaches us that we do need to go through a collapse before we can reconstitute. And we're sitting, I think, in the century that's going to make or break that idea. And those of us who will still be around sort of much later on, we'll have to live through the consequence of what that collapse and reconstitution actually looks like. And to be honest with you, considering the conditions that a majority of the world actually sits in right now, the collapse is probably going to be the worst for those of us, exactly who Philip was talking about, the we, who are the wealth, right, who actually hold on to most of the capital in the full sense of the term there. And but the power is also with us to navigate that collapse in such a way that it doesn't have to be disastrous for the whole planet, right? So are we actually able to learn and make the hard, uncomfortable choices now about that privilege that will enable us to have a better future? Because it's going to come, like the collapse is going to come at some point. We know we've set up this, there are lingering long-term factors that we're going to have to take into account for the next 100, 200 years in terms of what we've done to the biosphere. But yeah, are we able to learn quickly enough and to shake some of those institutional bounds when we can? And, you know, Kim Stanley Robertson's new book, The Ministry for the Future, that actually navigates a lot of that tension, and that survive the century sort of comment that I put in too, really does try and grapple with how we might be able to talk through transformation, which is uncomfortable, that is going to sort of be difficult. Transformative change isn't a nice, happy experience for everyone, right? It's about system reconfiguration, changing values, changing these deep-held emotional connections that we have, and rebuilding something different in its place. And it's also not an overnight project. So whether we're prepared to do that is my big question. But I think that's the discussion we need to be having when we're talking about these sort of these ecosystem restoration decades and things like that, is about that as, I think, an opportunity to start having that reality check discussion on what transformative change really actually means.
Great. Thanks
May
very
I
much.
may I just append from that? I think the collapse is already happening. I think what we're seeing, for instance, the collapse of the liberal project, both unfortunately with liberal democracy and with liberal economics, because it is simply, you know, 1989 was not the end of history. Global, you know, free markets have not won the heart of every society around the world. They've proved themselves to be just as colonialist a project as colonialism was. And, you know, we're beginning to see the breakdown of this liberal paradigm. And unfortunately, with it come, for instance, human rights and things like that. They are also breaking down. So I think this collapse is already happening. But as you say, I think, you know, we in the rich world, and I say we in the rich world because I'm sitting in the middle of it, we will be able to insulate ourselves better against that. I think that is, I think for poor people, when you see that, you know, the grain belt is migrating 20 kilometers away from the equator every year, then you see what that means for small landholders, for small farmers. And you can imagine the mass migration that begins with that. And, you know, our state had money to give us during the COVID crisis. Those states don't have money to give people because they are climate migrants. So I think they will be very cruelly hit. But I think the very critical thing in the future will be, will we have an economic collapse? Because, you know, the markets at the moment are in a huge speculative bubble, and there's very little real value that stands against it. And if we do that after 2008 and the COVID crisis, then I think there will be a really terrible spiral. Otherwise, I think we can manage the collapse, and we can replace it with something that is, as you said, Sweta, more worth living. And we need to remind ourselves of that. This is a stupid system we live in. It is a system designed for fictional people who do not exist. We are not free, rational individuals in competition with every other individuals in a society. That is simply a fiction. We can actually live more fulfilling lives, but we need to be successful in showing people that there are different identities, and that through this collapse, there are structures that may continue to carry, and that may, for instance, rid us in the rich West, because that's the only community I can speak for. Not the only community I believe is important, but the only one that I know something about. To rid us of this anxiety of identity. And the anxiety, also don't forget the anxiety of power. If you are the dominator, that's quite a lonely job. You're not part of a community. we live with terrible anxieties. Ask every psychiatrist around. That is not necessary. That's just a stupid system we've maneuvered ourselves into. And I think also if we approach things from that point of view, we can say, actually, we already live in a stupid dystopia. The point is we could change that. And nature is pushing us to do just that at the moment.
Thanks, Philip, for those wonderful words. I want to say after Laura, it's like, I was 20 when the German wall fell. I was 25 when I moved to South Africa, just after the historic election. And I got this feeling of this hope in the country where we're moving to something different. And I experienced it twice. It's like this hope, and yes, we can actually change and we move forward. And then in both times, we actually stuck in the same place again. And it's actually a horrible thought. And it's like, I'm going like, okay, now we're stuck in another horrible place and we need to move forward and we need to do something different again. And hopefully we actually change this time, we get the change right. And we're actually reaching slowly the end of our wonderful discussion. And I'm actually going to ask Casper and Sweta and then Laura for some final remarks to wrap up. It's been lovely, the conversation with you. So Casper, if you would like to start.
Yeah, I think despite my best intentions, I was more doomy and gloomy than I intended to be. And with your last words resonating, and of course there is always lock-ins and transitions fail. I think I would hang up on the word from Philip. I really like that as closing word. The collapse is actually already happening. And so we're moving the right direction, because I do think we need collapse. We need to build from the ruins, but perhaps the ruins can have lots of flowers already in them. And I think if we take it from there, we see the business as usual as a dystopia. So we're ready to build from ruins, even though we're not realizing we're living in them. Then I think this is the right time. And I think past failures shouldn't stop us from dreaming and hoping that this time we'll do it better. And I think there's good signs. And I think we're moving. I mean, this conversation that we're having right now, we couldn't have 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, let alone, in the Meadows report, who will feed China, and we're destroying the world, and nothing's going to save us anymore, and we need to, explore space because we need different planets. And I think that the overall feeling is changing in this community and in the climate change community as well, after the Paris Agreement. Another, 1.5 degree, what does it mean? But you have many more people coming up with brilliant solutions for mitigation and climate adaptation. And I think biodiversity is not going to be different. So I see lots of positive signs, actually.
Sorry, we do Laura first and then Sweta to give the youth the final word.
Great, thanks, Cornelia. And yeah, I mean, just to reinforce what everyone said, I think the take-homes really are that there is a movement. I think we are realizing rapidly that we need a different paradigm, a different way of doing things. We have the tools, we have the seeds, the innovation, the exciting things that are happening on the ground for change. And I think we need to focus on enabling those whilst also bringing down sort of the structures that are cognitive as well as embedded within just how our lives sort of talk. When we talk about consumerism, and it's really easy to fall into it, right? And so we do need to sort of continuously tell ourselves that we do want a different world, and it is possible, right? We're not talking about the completely impossible over here. But yeah, so for me, it really is about that plurality and that diversity, and about being able to navigate towards a more sustainable and just place that we can do. And we need our imaginations, and we need to be telling ourselves different stories, building new myths that we'll be able to take into this future.
Thank you, Laura. Sweta.
Yeah, so I was thinking, actually, I feel like a burden has been lifted, and maybe I could explain why I say that, because from the time the pandemic has happened, young people have been having a lot of these discussions, and what kind of like from all the discussions of talking to so many young people, the sense that I was getting is that they kind of feel this burden of like what's going to happen in the future, like a burden of what is this future that we're going to inherit. and what do we need to do to deal with it. So it's like, you know, a burden and a fear that is kind of in all our hearts. So, you know, is this the first pandemic? Are we going to have pandemics like every, you know, very often now? And is this going to be the future, that I'm just going to talk to people through Zoom? So, you know, there's so many questions and so many worries that we all have, that and that we are scared of what's going to come to the future. But I think today, like, Philip gave us a really nice way to lift out that burden by saying we're already in that place. We are already in the dystopic, catastrophic element that we had to be in. So we are there. So the only thing we can now do is go get better. So I guess that actually really changed the way I could even like explain it to the rest of the young people out there, that you don't think about what's going to be, it's not a fear of what's going to happen in the future, but rather it's already here, and now we can just build better now. And I think, yeah, my last word would just be to say that thank you, I guess. Thank you so much for giving us this really interesting philosophical, but also very concrete discussion, which actually can be taken in, and we at least can take this forward and, you know, bring it back to the community and, you know, start building on some of the stuff that all of you have talked about. So I do see this as a very concrete, starting very philosophically, but going into a very concrete discussion. So I hope that you guys do stay in touch with us and see how young people are going to take this forward. And my last word would just be like, to say that, you know, that's our campaign slogan. We are saying to the world, same sucks. And what we're telling the world now is it's time to stop the same. And it's time that we build back diverse in all the ways possible. So I think with that, I would like to say thank you for having young people be a part of this conversation, and for also helping us brainstorm such amazing ideas with you.
Yes, thanks very much, Sweta. Thanks very much, everyone, for those inspiring discussions. There's been a lot going on in the chat and the discussion. I invite you all to join us in the LinkedIn group, continue this discussion. Next World Biodiversity Forum, in person and hybrid, is planned for 2022. So I hope that we'll see each other again, either via Zoom or in person, to continue those conversations. So thank you very much. Have a good day. Have a good evening. It was lovely having you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.